his wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Now, I can kind of see this story going down in my head, and, I kind of just picture Abraham and Sarah. They're sitting at the dinner table, or they're sitting in their tent, maybe watching Canaan Idol, or, dancing with the Pharaoh or something. They're just chilling there, and Sarah kind of turns to Abram, and she says, God promised a long time ago that we were going to have a son. And Abraham's probably, yeah, you're right. And she says, God, he hasn't given us a son. He hasn't let us have a son yet. And Abraham's, yeah, you're right. And then she says, I think you should marry my maid and have a child by them. At least then we can have that son that God always promised. And now, I'm no expert on women. You can tell that because I'm a guy. And I'm not married. I have a girlfriend, and I think I know what my response would have been if I was Abraham. And if I was Abraham and Sarah told that to me, I think my reaction would be like, "Are you kidding me? Are you trying to test me? Did Lot put you up to this? Where is that guy?" I think that's what Abraham's reaction should have been. He should have been so appalled by that suggestion. But what we see here in Abraham and Sarah's life is that they wanted a child so bad. They wanted something that God promised them so bad that they were willing to break God's commandments to get it. And even though God had continually promised Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a son, he promised in Genesis 12, Genesis 13, Genesis 15, that they were going to have this son, that they were going to have a nation, they had this moment of doubt and this moment of disbelief, and that one moment has caused Israel generations upon generations upon generations of pain and suffering. They tried to skip ahead of God's timing. Even though God really did want them to have a son and really did want them to have a family, it wasn't the time, it wasn't the place, and it wasn't the way. And so the second attitude that they were really portraying was that I want to do what I want to do. I want to do my will, and I want to do it my way. And it's just an attitude of complete rebellion against God. And before we start jumping on Abraham and Sarah and just saying, why would you even think about doing that? Why weren't you thinking, didn't you listen to God? I mean, is it really that different than whenever we abandon the commandments and abandon the promises that's mentioned in Scripture? I mean, so many times, we read verses like, He will never leave us or forsake us, but yet we live in such doubt and we live in such worry. He says that if we come to Him, He can take our burdens. He can make our burdens light, but yet we still try to carry them every day. He says that all things will work together for those of us that love the Lord, but yet how often do we really believe that? And Abraham and Sarah were just a good illustration of how whenever we don't believe, that those things can come back and haunt us, and those things can cause generations and generations and generations of pain for a very long time. And like Abraham and Sarah, sometimes we'll even maybe justify our sinning and justify us going outside of the will of God by claiming that actually it's helping God out, like it's helping Him fulfill His goal, like as if He needed our help. We might say, well, God really wants me to provide for my family. If I don't provide for my family, then I'm worse than an unbeliever, and I really can't provide for my family if I'm tithing. I can't give them everything that they deserve or that they want. Or in other cases, we don't always believe, like there's so many teenage girls that don't always believe that they're fearfully and wonderfully made, and they try to find love in other places. And those things can cause pain for a very long time because we don't believe. We have moments of disbelief. And so the second attitude of Sarah and Abraham was really that they wanted to do their own will. They wanted to do it their own way. And the last attitude is in Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. And just as a quick timeline of Abraham's life, from Abraham and Sarah probably married earlier on in life, and then about at age 75, maybe a few years before, God started promising that Abraham would have this son, would have this nation. And by the time you're 75, you probably have given up hope completely that you're ever going to have a son again. But whenever he got this promise, he's had this renewed hope, and it's like, okay, maybe we will get a family finally. They waited for so long. And then it's another 10 years before the account that we just read in Genesis chapter 16 happens, where they start to fade out a little bit. And then it's another 15 years before they actually have their son Isaac. I mean, think about what you were doing 25 years ago. I wasn't doing much of anything 25 years ago. And that's the time that it took for God's promise to come true. Sometimes it takes time for these things to happen. And so let's look at chapter 22, verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountains which I will tell thee of. And let's move down to verse 9 for time's sake. And they came into the place where God had told them of, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And so now in Genesis chapter 22, it really is striking parallelism to when God first called Abraham. This time, or last time, he said, Abraham, leave your country and go to the place that I'm going to show you. This time he says, all right, leave everything, go to the mountain that I will show you. And now you're going to have to sacrifice your son. And I love really what God does in verse 2, because when he's talking to Abraham, it almost seems like he's almost rubbing it in his face, making the wound a little bit deeper. And he says, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom you lovest, the one that's your pride and joy, the one that's everything to you. Take him and go sacrifice him. So then they went out and they went to the Mount Moriah to go and sacrifice Isaac, and just Abraham and Isaac walked up to the mountain that day, and I can only imagine what was really going through their heads. And in between, chapter 16 and chapter 25, or whenever we first see Abraham to right now, there's a lot of tough times went on in Abraham's life, and stories that I didn't have time to get to of how they lied to Pharaoh and said that they were brother and sister to keep Abraham from dying. And there's a lot of issues with Lot, and there's a lot of tough times in their life. But if you can imagine, there's probably a lot of joyous times in their life of recently. If you waited 100 years for your first child, you waited 25 years from a promise from God, then whenever you receive that promise, whenever you first have that child, could you imagine just the joy and just the honor and how spoiled rotten that little Isaac must have been if his parents were 100 years old? I mean, I don't even know what you do when your parents are 100 years old, but and every time you go outside, everybody would be like, oh, you're spending the day with your grandparents. No, it's my parents. But no matter what, there's probably a lot of just joyous times and a lot of good times that they waited their entire life for. And now as Abraham is walking his son up, and he has to do what God commanded him to, of sacrificing his only son. And Isaac probably was a young man because he was talking to Abraham throughout this. And so Abraham gets up there and he starts wrapping his hands and tying his legs up, and he helps him up to the altar, and he reaches back to go get his knife. And right as he grabs the knife, the very knife that he has to kill his son with, that's when the angel of the Lord, which is commonly a name referred to like a pre-incarnate Jesus, that's when he comes and he says, Abraham, Abraham, don't touch him. You don't have to touch him, Abraham. God was testing you. God wanted to see that you loved him more than you loved anything. You loved him more than that promise that he gave you, that you knew that God was going to save him. From Hebrews, we find out that Abraham believed that God was going to, he had enough belief and enough faith that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. which was especially really powerful just because until that time, nobody's been raised from the dead. That doesn't even happen to Elijah. So he literally believed in the impossible, that if God made him a promise, he was going to keep it no matter what. And he didn't understand what was going on at that point, but he knew God was going to come through with him.